It was a cold winter evening in the remote cabin that John called home, nestled deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest neighbor. The snow had been falling steadily for hours, blanketing the ground in a thick layer of white. It was the kind of night that felt as if the world was covered in a silent, icy blanket, with nothing but the crackling of the fire in the cabin to break the stillness. John, a man accustomed to the solitude of his surroundings, sat by the fire, sipping on a warm mug of coffee. The day had been uneventful, just the usual routine of chopping wood, checking his traps, and tending to the fire. He didn't mind the isolation. In fact, it was something he had grown used to over the years. But tonight, something felt different. There was a restlessness in the air, an unspoken tension that he couldn't quite shake. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and the forest seemed to hum with an eerie quietness. John pushed the nagging feeling aside, convincing himself it was just the wind playing tricks on him. But then, as if on cue, a faint noise reached his ears. At first, it was just a soft scratching sound, barely audible over the howling wind. John paused, his senses sharpening. What was that? He listened again, straining to hear over the storm outside. This time it was clearer, a rhythmic tapping, like something was at the door. His heart skipped a beat. Was someone out there? John's mind raced. It could be anyone. An animal, perhaps. But this was no time for wild imagination. He had dealt with many animals over the years, but none had ever come so close to his door, especially not in this kind of weather. He stood up slowly, his boots crunching on the wooden floor as he moved toward the door. Should I open it? The question echoed in his mind. He hesitated for a moment. The isolation had taught him to be cautious, but this was different. There was something urgent in the sound, something pleading. With a deep breath, he reached for the door handle. His hand trembled slightly as he turned it, the old hinges groaning as the door creaked open. The cold air rushed in, sending a chill up his spine, but what he saw outside made him freeze. Standing just beyond the threshold were 3 small bear cubs. Their fur was matted with snow, and they huddled together, their little bodies shaking from the cold. They were no older than a few months, barely able to stand on their own. John's heart went out to them. They were just babies, lost and exposed to the brutal winter conditions. But it wasn't just the cubs that took him by surprise. Behind them, standing as still as a statue, was the mother bear. Her massive frame was coated in snow, and her eyes locked onto John's with an intensity that stopped him in his tracks. There was no growl, no sign of aggression, just a calm, almost solemn stare. The mother bear's eyes were filled with something John hadn't expected, a deep, quiet vulnerability. She wasn't here to fight. She wasn't here to hunt. She was here because she needed help. John stood frozen, unsure of what to do. The cubs were looking up at him with wide, frightened eyes, their tiny paws pressed against the door, desperately trying to get closer to the warmth inside. The mother bear remained still, as if waiting for him to make a decision. Should I let them in? His thoughts raced. A bear with cubs could be dangerous, especially if it felt threatened. The wild was unpredictable, and no one could be sure how a mother bear would react in such a situation. Yet there was something in the bear's posture, in the way she watched him, that spoke of trust, of a plea for help. The cold air around him seemed to close in, and John could feel the weight of the moment. What if he didn't act? What if the bear and her cubs froze out there? His instincts kicked in. He had spent years in the wilderness, learning to read the signs of nature. He knew that this wasn't just a chance encounter. This was a moment that would define everything. He took a step back, still unsure, but the bear didn't move. Her gaze never left him, and the cubs, trembling, began to whimper softly as if urging him to make up his mind. The decision was now his. John's breath fogged up the glass as he stared out into the snow-covered forest. The cubs, their tiny faces pressed against the door, were visibly trembling from the cold. The mother bear remained still behind them, her eyes locked on him, filled with an intensity that was hard to ignore. There was something almost human in her gaze, a silent plea for help. For a moment, everything seemed to slow down. The weight of the decision hung heavy in the air. Should he open the door and risk everything? He had always been taught to respect the wild, to keep his distance from dangerous animals, especially bears. But this was no ordinary encounter. These cubs were helpless. They were just babies, barely old enough to fend for themselves. And the mother bear, she wasn't acting aggressively. She wasn't here to attack. She was here for something else. John's mind raced as he considered the risks. A bear, especially a mother with her cubs, was unpredictable. The very nature of the wild was built on survival, and no one could be certain how an animal would react when its young were threatened. But the more John stared into the bear's eyes, the more he realized that this wasn't an attack. This was a desperate situation, one that he had to decide how to handle. His hand hovered over the door handle again. If he opened it, would the mother bear feel safe enough to trust him? Would she see him as a protector, or would she see him as a threat? The uncertainty was overwhelming, but in that moment, he couldn't turn away. He couldn't turn his back on the animals standing at his door. He glanced down at the cubs again. Their small faces were filled with a kind of innocent trust, their eyes wide and searching for comfort. They didn't know what danger they were in. They only knew that the warmth of the cabin could save them from the harsh cold outside. They needed him. They were innocent, vulnerable, and in that moment, they were looking to him for help. John felt a sudden rush of emotion. He had spent years working in the woods, learning how to survive, how to read the land. But nothing in his life had prepared him for this moment, the moment where he would have to make a decision that could change everything. Could he really turn them away? He swallowed hard, his resolve building. With one last glance at the bear, he made up his mind. Slowly, carefully, he reached for the door handle and began to open it. The cold air hit him immediately, biting at his skin, but he didn't flinch. The cubs shuffled closer, their tiny paws reaching for him as if they knew he was their only hope. The mother bear remained still, her massive form blocking the snowstorm outside, but her gaze never left him. There was no growl, no warning. It was just her quiet presence, and the cubs behind her, trusting him to make the right choice. John stepped aside, motioning for the cubs to enter. As they hesitated for a moment, unsure, the mother bear took a step forward. Her eyes, filled with a mix of uncertainty and trust, met John's. She was ready. And then, as if making the same choice that John had, the mother bear lowered her head, acknowledging that this was her only chance. She stepped past the threshold, bringing her cubs with her. The warmth from inside the cabin enveloped them. The cubs, still shivering, moved quickly toward the fireplace, their tiny bodies seeking the warmth they so desperately needed. The mother bear followed, her eyes still locked on John, but now with a softening look, a look that spoke of gratitude, of trust. John closed the door behind them, the sound of the wind outside muffled by the warmth within. He stood there for a moment, frozen, watching the family of bears huddle near the fire. He had done it. He had made the choice to open the door, to help. The cabin was warm, a stark contrast to the brutal cold outside. John stood by the door, still in shock at the decision he had just made. As the mother bear and her cubs settled near the fireplace, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. He had opened his door to wild animals, dangerous creatures, and now they were inside, safe from the freezing temperatures. The cubs were huddled together, their tiny bodies still trembling from the cold, but now they were beginning to warm up, their fur slowly drying by the fire. The mother bear stood near them, her gaze shifting from her cubs to John. There was something in her eyes, a quiet understanding, as though she knew that he had just made a life-changing choice for her and her babies. John slowly moved across the room, careful not to make any sudden movements. He didn't want to startle them, especially the mother bear, who could easily overpower him if she felt threatened. But as he approached, the bear didn't react aggressively. Instead, she simply watched him, her expression calm but alert. It was then that he realized something profound. The bond between them had shifted. He had made the decision to help, but now the bear and her cubs had trusted him completely. In a way, he had done something more than just offer warmth and shelter. He had shown compassion, something rare and powerful in the wild. John stood still for a moment, watching the bears, his heart full of emotions he couldn't quite describe. Gratitude, perhaps, for the chance to help them, but also something deeper. A respect for the wildness of nature and for the unexpected bond that had formed in his own cabin. And as the fire crackled softly behind him, he knew this would be a story he would never forget, one that would stay with him, always.